Well, good morning. In 2014, a young British couple named Esther Dingley and Dan Colgate, in their early 30s, having suffered some health problems psychologically and physically, made a radical decision. They decided to get rid of their home in Britain, to buy a camper van, and to head off to Europe on a grand adventure. And some of you will have heard of this adventure. They were to climb the mountains and walk the hills, rediscover the purpose of life, break out of the mold of their lives, overcome the psychological issues they'd faced, and basically make a fresh start. Some of you heard of this couple. They posted an interesting blog. They went on social media, and they were picked up by national media some years on as a couple who traveled around Europe, exploring and adventuring in a remarkable way. Then I became interested in them, and I followed them. Then in November of last year, there was an unusual post from this couple. She, Esther, was going to go on a solo hiking trip, just as a little adventure on her own. They'd always been together, and people speculated what the reason for this might be. And she was going to the Pyrenees. That interested me because I'd been there once before. And then in November last year, suddenly, she disappeared. Totally. She stopped texting. Nobody knew where she was. And the trail went totally cold for a period of time. Had she run away? Had she had an accident? Had she been kidnapped? Nobody had the faintest idea, and it became a social media sensation. And I focused in on the story with particular interest at this point when I noticed, to my astonishment, that the place she disappeared, and I noticed it from a picture, was a mountain in the Pyrenees which I myself had climbed alone many years before. Rather by accident. I was supposed to be in a group, but the group didn't work out and I ended up on my own. Not something I generally recommend. And so I thought, in this very place she's disappeared. Now, some 8 months later, her body was discovered, and it was clear she had an accident on her own. And nobody was there, nobody saw it, nobody came to help. She fell off the side of the track inexplicably, and died probably instantaneously. And so this became a very well-known story, which I got very engaged with personally because I knew the location. I could almost envisage the exact place where this might happen. And a question arose in my heart, and the question is, why? Why should a young person, fitter and stronger than me, who'd walked the same tracks of many years before, extremely experienced, have had this accident? Why this tragedy to this young couple emerging in life in their late 30s? Why this incredible tragedy that engulfed their family? And all of our life is faced with questions of why. Why things are so difficult and so complicated. Why suffering? Why sudden death? Why do things go wrong? And this is our question today. And I remember as a very naive 14-year-old at a privileged boarding school, being rather restless in the boarding school, volunteering for something called voluntary service with a friend of mine in order to get out of the campus, get some time out. And as a rather naive youngster, us two guys, we went to a very poor home in a council estate in the town we were in, to a couple called Pat and Don, and we were there to help them. Now, we didn't know anything. We were naive, self-assured, looking for an easy life, wanting to get off campus. Now, Don had multiple sclerosis, and he was in an advanced stage of the illness, and he couldn't speak. He could only issue incoherent sounds. Hoists and lifts and everything else were installed in the house, and Pat, this middle-aged working-class lady, was nobly and heroically looking after her husband in his dying years. And as I looked around the house and I looked in the sitting room, I saw a wonderful photo of him, such a strong and healthy man who'd held down a job and looked after his family, had children, suddenly struck down in his late 40s. And now, here he was in his 50s, heading to the end of his life. Now, we entered into conversation with Pat, who was very friendly to us, about what this all meant. And we stumbled around nervously and anxiously, not knowing what to say. I remember feeling very embarrassed by these conversations because I had no idea whatsoever what to say to this lady about suffering. I knew nothing of it in any significance. And I remember her comments to this day. Sometimes in a philosophical moment she said, well, it's meant to be. It's in the destiny, invoking some vague divine power. But then in moments of frustration, when she had a really hard day and we knocked on the door and offered to help, she says, it's just not fair what's happened to me. The heart cry came out from this poor lady. In a more positive mood, she might say, I'm thankful for the small mercies. Or we had a good life together. Or I'll try to make something of my life when he dies. And here are the characteristic emotions and responses of ordinary people without faith, trying to make sense of an incomprehensible mystery as to why one person suffers and another one doesn't. Why does one person fall off the edge of the mountain and the other person survives? Why does one person get struck down with a mystery neurological illness like MS when he'd lived a good life and had been a good father and a good husband and he'd brought the money in week by week, judging by everything we could find out? And so these experiences shape us, and that experience never left me because I felt so totally out of my depth. I had nothing to say to this lady before I had any faith. I just listened and I learned from her. And this is human life. And today, I was thinking about another issue and wondering how to respond. The tragic murder of an MP 2 days ago in Britain, in broad daylight, by an Islamic activist with a knife. An MP I've heard a lot about and who's collaborated with a lot of good causes and collaborated with many Christian initiatives. And I thought, what is my response to this? This is so unjust. How do you feel about that? It evokes such deep emotions within us if we allow them to. And my instinctive response was to think of his wife and his 5 children. But then secondly, my thought went to our MP. And I contacted him this morning in my quiet time by a private communication I have with him to say to our MP, I'm praying for you. Keep doing your work. How's he feeling? Suffering is the issue that we're facing in this second talk. And the talk is entitled The Fall. And we're going to look into a Christian understanding of how such a complex and painful world could ever come into being and how on earth do we navigate it. And there have been many answers to this question. The Hindus will characteristically say, the traditional Hindus, that it's an inevitability. There's a certain karma. You just have to face your destiny in this life, and it may be related to your previous life in a reincarnation cycle. The Buddhist will characteristically think and say that suffering ultimately is an illusion. We need to detach ourselves from the emotion and the experience through meditation and other techniques. And in the Jewish scriptures, we find a slightly different response because the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, allow the cry of anguish to be heard. The cry of Job Why me? The cry of the writer of Ecclesiastes in old age and depression, saying, what on earth is the meaning of life? I don't even know what life's worth. I've worked hard all my life, but it doesn't make any sense to me. I feel depressed. The cry of David the psalmist when he's being unfairly chased and persecuted by Saul and his armies and is just an inch away from being assassinated. These are the cries we hear coming, the voices of the Old Testament coming down to us. But then what about our secular world today? What about the people who said, well, actually, I don't believe in God? And there are many of those people, it's pretty nominal belief. What about a world which is controlled purely by natural forces, natural selection, the laws of physics? The world so proudly presented to us by the secular scientific pundits of our age. Well, there's a problem. And I saw this problem very clearly one day. 15 years ago, Richard Dawkins came to speak at a live lecture in Shrewsbury, and I was amongst those listening to him, the great proponent of evolution. And he was asked questions about human morality, loving your neighbor. Why should an evolutionist, he was asked, believe that we should love one another? Where did this impulse to love come from? And he couldn't give a coherent answer. He stumbled in his answers. And he spent a long time since then writing about this to try and rectify this stumbling. Because ultimately, if there's no moral rule giver, there's no basis for morality. And if everything is through cause and effect in a naturalistic process, then there's no answer to why somebody should suffer. It's just the inexorable laws of nature working out, and they happen to hit you, and there's really nothing you can do about it. Well, I would say ultimately this is a very pessimistic philosophy if you follow it through logically. But where do we stand by contrast to the Hindus and the Buddhists and the Jews of the Old Testament and the secularists of today? And my friend Pat, who had no particular philosophy of life back then in the 1970s when I knocked on her door every week and offered to do her garden. She was just wrestling with the unknown, as so many people are that you know, who don't have any particular belief system. They're just trying to put the pieces together, and they find that the jigsaw doesn't easily fit together. And so for us as believers, our story starts, of course, in the book of Genesis, where we were last time. And we saw in Genesis 1 some magnificent things. The fact that God is the creator of this universe. It didn't create itself by the laws of science. We saw that initially everything God made was described as very good, in other words, perfectly functional and would fulfill its purpose. And we saw that mankind was positioned in a unique place in this world in the image of God, male and female. He created them in order to be God's agents, to rule and look after this world. But we have to move forward in the story a little bit. And today we're just going to touch briefly and just very much in part on a couple of things that are said in the next two chapters, because the whole of our philosophy of life is based on understanding Genesis 1, Genesis 2, and Genesis 3. These are three fundamental foundations, and the first one is Genesis 1, and we discussed that last time. But in Genesis 2, it focuses much more on mankind, and it starts with Adam. And it says in verse 7, "Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." And we know from this that humanity came directly from God's creative power, not indirectly from other animals. But then what happened in verse 15 to this man? The Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. And the Lord God commanded the man, "You're free to eat. You're free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will certainly die." Two things happened at the very, very beginning with Adam. He was given a responsibility for the created earth, represented by the Garden of Eden in the first instance, to cultivate and develop it. work to do. And secondly, he was given a moral command, a boundary. God gave mankind a responsibility to cultivate and develop this world, but he gave them a moral boundary, which in this particular case was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then immediately after, as Eve was created and they became partners together, they joined together in this responsibility. But there was a moral boundary. And that means, ultimately, there was a choice. A choice for Adam and Eve. They weren't robots. They had an element of moral, personal choice. And so as our story rolls forward to Genesis chapter 3, and most of you know this story well. You may treat it as a symbol, you may treat it as history, whichever way you go, you can still come to the same conclusion. I'm not going to debate it either way at this particular point, but introduced into the story, at the beginning of chapter 3 and verse 1, is a mysterious serpent, not identified here, but identified in the book of Revelation as an incarnation of evil, spiritual, demonic power. Another force operating in the world, hitherto unspoken of in the book of Genesis. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals that the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat of any tree in the garden?" And so we have the famous story of the temptation of Eve. And by the way, Adam was present and both were culpable. And the choice was exercised. That choice was made. Probably a long period of time had elapsed between the creation and this event. The creation of Adam and Eve and this event. But anyway, at a certain point, they chose to go beyond the moral boundary. And so came into the experience of the whole of the earth, and indeed the cosmos, a new reality which we call theologically the fall, or the fall of man. And this is represented in Genesis 3 by a series of curses. The man and the woman between them, and these would be shared between them in different proportions, would be experiencing particular suffering in the bringing forth of children, the particular difficulty in relationships between them, particular difficulty in cultivating the earth, and they would uniquely find that their lives would not continue forever, but would be limited by time, and so they would return to the dust. Death. And they were expelled from the garden. Now, at this point, we already know the following thing: that the experience of dysfunction and separation and pain and suffering that we experience has three elements in it. It's got the activity of hostile spiritual powers who are against the human race, the serpent. It's got the fact that the earth itself is no longer in that perfect state of functionality. Cursed be the ground before you, to Adam. And so with difficulty would he bring forth the food from the ground. In other words, the earth is now going to represent two realities: incredible design, but partial dysfunction. And that's exactly what we see. We can see the design, but it's not the only thing we see. We see that sometimes things go wrong organically or systemically. We have two things now in the organic world around us. So we have evil powers, we have the dysfunction of the natural world, and we also have the consequences of our own behavior towards one another, which produces spectacular amounts of suffering. in human life. If you think of some of the suffering you've experienced, or people you know have experienced, some of it you may put down to sort of creational causes, things that have gone wrong organically, some disease or something like that. Some of it you may put down by discernment to a direct activity of an evil force. But much of it, I guarantee, will be what other people did to you personally, or in the background as governments and powers and companies and armies, which affects you. And so we see in Genesis 3, the slide into darkness begins. And if you read from Genesis 3 through to Genesis 11, you'll see an increase in this darkness. You'll see murder comes, polygamy instead of monogamy, violence instead of peace, civil conflict develops. And all along, mankind is asserting his independence of God. So this is our story. And so what does the New Testament say about this? What does the New Testament say? Very interesting that in Romans 8, Paul deals with this issue very directly, and this is my key text for today. We're going to read from Romans 8, verse 18 through to verse 24. Paul, of all the writers of the New Testament, addresses this complex picture very, very powerfully in Romans 8. And of course, what God began to do about it after these events in Genesis was to begin a salvation plan, and that's what we're going to look at next time we meet. And that will start with Abraham and the Jews and come to Jesus Christ, and that story is yet to be told. But Paul now, looking from a Christian point of view, wants to help his readers understand the complex experiences they have in life in a proper way. And so he says the following things, and I'll just comment on these verses as we go through. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. He is speaking here in this verse of the coming of Jesus Christ and the resurrection of the body, which are simultaneous realities. The glory will be revealed in us. Now, we're suffering now, but keep in mind, this is not the only reality. You see, the secular person has no eternal reality, no next life. You have to compress all meaning into this life, and that's where it becomes difficult because it doesn't fit together. You can't explain everything. There's no answers to everything. But Paul's perspective is there is an eternal reality, and for the believer has to sometimes just hang on. And for some of you today listening to this, maybe the most important thing that you'll hear from this is hang on if you're suffering. And trust God. And then he goes on in verse 19 to speak about the creation. When he uses the word creation, he means non-human created reality, the organic life, the animal life, and the whole structure of our world, apart from humanity. The creation. Listen to what he says. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed. Here he's going into metaphorical language, of course. The creation, the natural world, is connected to us so closely that it cannot be redeemed from all the dysfunction that came at the very beginning until we are redeemed from it. When we experience resurrection, the natural world will experience a regeneration or a resurrection all of its own, which many Christians never even think about, but is a fundamental biblical reality. There will be a new heaven and a new earth. So speaking metaphorically, the creation is waiting. Verse 20, for the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, that's God himself, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. So the creation experiences metaphorically frustration and decay. Frustration means you can't reach the goal that you know is a potential for you. Do you remember Dina Asher-Smith, the runner in the Olympics in Japan? Do you remember her story? She won the World Championships in 2019 and was tipped to win the female 100 and 200 meters in Japan. She was on the form of her life. And about 6 weeks before the Olympics, she experienced a hamstring injury during another event. Radical medical treatment took place. She competed, but she couldn't achieve her potential. And she said, obviously I was not my normal self. The most frustrating thing is I was in the shape of my life. And I can say with my hand on my heart, if you'd asked me 6 weeks ago, I was confident I was going to win the entire thing. She experienced frustration because she knew what she could do, but she couldn't do what she could do because of the limitations of her body, the proneness to injury. Now, what we experience in humans in frustration, which, by the way, Andy Murray's been experiencing for 4 years. If you follow Andy Murray's heroic attempts to come back from a career-threatening hip injury, it's beyond heroics in my mind. He just goes on and on and on, trying to overcome the limitations of his body. He knows what he can do. Goodness me, he's won Grand Slam events. He's won Wimbledon twice. He's won the US Open. He's an incredible tennis player, but his body is more limited than his overall capacity, and so he experienced frustration, and everybody in this room knows what that means about your bodily capacity, especially those of you who are nearer to my age. And in that experience, we can connect with what Paul is trying to say, that actually the whole created order is underperforming. It's below capacity. You might think it's a great capacity. I tell you, it's a lot less than it could be, because it was very good and they're perfectly functioning in the original, and it's become dysfunctional as a result of the fall. You will be amazed at the beauty and wonder and functionality of the created order in the new earth. I guarantee. You'll be amazed. It's a far greater creation than we ever see. It's been hindered, it's been slowed up in mysterious ways that are hard to designate. It experiences frustration, but it also experiences decay. We all know what we mean by decay. We experience it painfully in our teeth. We experience it in our bodies. We experience it in aging. I spent 10 years walking the journey of old age with my father in his 80s, where he could no longer travel too far. No longer walk to town, no longer do the gardening, no longer do basic housework. And his power's diminished. Decay. We know what decay is. And the scientists tell us our world is decaying. Their conclusion is, Brian Cox cheerfully says on The Infinite Monkey Cage, well, one day we won't exist and they won't exist and it won't really matter. Well, that's not a great future. It's not a biblical future. God says what is decaying, I can restore. What I made, I can remake. What is lost can be found. What is broken can be redeemed. That's the gospel, but I'm putting the gospel on a maximum possible canvas. I'm not just talking about you as an individual person. I'm talking about the whole of creation and all of humanity who choose to say independence is no good. So many people are proud of their independence, and I always smile inwardly when they say that to me, because I think you wait. A little bit further down the line, you'll realize the limitation. The most powerful people in the world are the dependent ones. They know God. They get his power, which is a lot more than our own power. Let's be his sons and daughters and be proud of it. And so Paul speaks in verse 22 that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. That's the new heaven and the new earth. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we also who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. That's the second coming. We wait for the second coming. Can I tell you, the second coming is not just for you. It's not just a pass out of the difficulties of this life. The second coming is the trigger for the recreation of the whole cosmos. The new heaven and the new earth. Verse 24. In this hope we were saved. This is the biblical hope. Now, it's not particularly fashionable amongst Christians to emphasize the doctrine of the fall. And clearly it's only part of the story. And for the rest of these talks beyond today, I will be talking about the astonishing redemptive plans of God that started with Abraham and Israel and through Jesus Christ came to the church and then ultimately will lead to a new creation. But today we're pausing on the fall. It's unfashionable sometimes to allow us to really take seriously how significant it is that this world is not as it should be, and there are significant factors at play. The dysfunctionality of the world, the volcano and the earthquake and the harvest failure. The unpredictable rise of disease spontaneously. It never occurred to me back when I was a teenager going to Pat and Don's house that one day I'd be thinking the thoughts that Pat was thinking. Because my wife would suffer from a different and less critical but significant neurological disease, ME. But I have to face it. God can redeem, God can heal. But all of us have to be able to face the complexities of a suffering world. And the doctrine of the fall helps us to understand that satanic forces are seeking to destroy humanity, and Christ came to break that power, and he did indeed break that power at the cross. And that will be seen comprehensively in the future at the second coming. But we also need to take on board, fundamentally, psychologically in our own thinking, the sheer terrible consequences of the fact that humanity is disconnected from God. In the last century, this has produced unspeakable suffering in this world at the hands of humans alone. We have had the bloodiest century in all of human history by a long margin in the 20th century, with terrible wars across the world, causing millions to die and millions more to suffer. We've had the rise of brutal dictatorial regimes causing the death of millions of their own citizens, including in Russia and in China and elsewhere. We've had terrible tribal conflicts in Africa. We've had all sorts of things going on. We've had a terrible century, the 20th century, in many ways. The fall is a reality. And we're now seeing the consequences of the failed relationship between mankind and the natural world. As we've taken too much, and now it's looking, for the first time in human history, deeply fragile. The fall is a serious reality. And we do well to really say this is how serious it is. And it gives us a fantastic platform to understand how great is the redemption Christ brings. Because none of this is the counsel of pessimism. He's on the move. In this terrible 20th century of suffering, we have seen the greatest rise and growth of the church in the whole of church history. All is not lost. Because in the words of Narnia, Aslan is on the move. In the words of Scripture, we're waiting for the redemption of our bodies, our adoption to sonship. We're waiting for the second coming, and it's sure to happen. The fall will be redeemed. But we do well to face the reality for what it is. It's the only way we can explain the complex balance that we see in our experience between the evidence of design, the work of grace, God doing amazing things in people's lives, and the continuation of great and difficult suffering within all of the human race in countless different ways. So I'm going to end this talk in a slightly different way. I'm going to do what I did last time. In a moment, I'm going to play a song to you that you probably won't have heard. Hear the Song of Our Lament by Resound Worship. And this song, unlike many Christian songs today, tries to get to grips with the doctrine of the fall. You can see the gospel coming through, and it shows a heart cry of asking God to have mercy and to intervene. And it reflects what those early humans must have felt in the early days as things were going from bad to worse. And God moved, and he called a man called Abraham. And he started his redemptive purposes out there in the Middle East. And that's our next story when we look at the history of Israel in our Big Picture series. Let's play this song. Hear the song of our lament. Have mercy, renew us, restore us, have mercy on us, Lord.